Welcome to the Workplace Therapy Podcast, the show where we talk about the messy, meaningful, and often misunderstood side of leadership, the human side. I'm your host, Scott Arrieta. I'm the CEO of Unity & Company. At Unity, we partner with mission-driven brands to align their leadership, unlock their culture, and accelerate what's possible. And today, I am so excited to welcome back a friend of the show, Dr. Barzel, for another thoughtful and insightful conversation that you're not going to want to miss. So for those of you who are not acquainted with Dr. Barzel, he's an accomplished certified ProSci change management practitioner and learning strategist with over 18 years of hands-on experience driving organizational transformations and delivering strategic change consulting. He's recognized as an expert in high reliability organizations. Dr. Barzel has a proven track record in large-scale systems training, leadership development, competency modeling, and strategic planning processes across diverse sectors, including healthcare, civil and defense government clients. As a faculty member at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, Dr. Barzel teaches courses in organizational change management and strategic human resources management, shaping the next generation of leaders as part of Peabody's Leadership and Organizational Effectiveness track. And with advanced degrees including a Doctor of Education in Leadership and Learning in Organizations and a Master of Education in Curriculum and Instructional Leadership from Vanderbilt University's Peabody College, along with a solid foundation in education and history, Dr. Barzel brings a rich blend of academic rigor, practical expertise, and passion for empowering organizations to achieve sustainable, high-performing cultures. Dr. Barzel, thank you so much for being back on the show with us today.
Thanks for having me, Scott. I'm really excited for our conversation.
As am I, my friend. All right, so just to tee up the work that we're going to be doing in today's session, can you tell us a little bit about what drew you to the work of change, resilience, and systems thinking?
I think that I was really drawn to this work from the frustration of how well-intentioned people burn out. Not because they lack skill or will, but because their environment just works against them. And that led me to systems thinking and high reliability organization principles, things that we talked about when we last connected. And I really became fascinated with how to build structures that support resilience, to create clarity, that promote psychological safety, which is something that I want to bring up again because we've talked about it in the past. The idea here is how to create systems that people feel safe to speak up, to test ideas, and recover from failure without fear. And I have to say that I really matured my thinking here. I came to see that transformation isn't about fixing people, because initially we'd have a problem and I would think, okay, well, maybe we need more training. We need to kind of fix the person. We need to sit down and understand what their problem is and why they're not working or why it's not working for them. Instead, I started to really understand that it's about redesigning the system so that people can thrive. The insight has shaped really how I support organizations, not just by offering strategies, but by helping them build environments that allow curiosity, feedback, and failure to live side by side with performance.
I love those insights, Dr. Barzel, and I think it's really important. I just want to pick out something
Sure.
that maybe a lot of people didn't catch in what you just said. But, you talked about your fascination with organizations and building resilience. And, in our work with organizations at Unity, I think a misconception that leaders commonly walk into is that they're hiring for resilience, rather, and not necessarily this insight of setting up the systems or really
Right.
establishing the conditions for which resilience can be developed innately and internally by the people that you do hire, and the responsibility that we as leaders have to be thinking about things in a systems-oriented way.
Yeah, it's a great point. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So moving on to the next piece, in your thoughts about building and cultivating resilience and developing this confidence within employees and organizations, we've talked a lot about bright spots and how leaders can effectively utilize these stories and understanding of the things that have gone well to really kind of systematically engineer momentum and continuity along those lines in the future. But this seems to be a fairly obvious insight, Dr. Barzel, but why do you think that it is that it's so easy for organizations to overlook these bright spots, to really focus on what's not working instead of looking at what is working and trying to perpetuate that?
Okay, so as you mentioned in the introduction, I spent 18 years in management consulting, working for a wonderful management consulting firm, Booz Allen Hamilton, and I had an opportunity to really explore a lot of different client problems and anything that came with those. And I think that conditionally we hunt for problems. As human beings, as consultants in my work, a client comes to you with a problem and you're designed to like hunt for the source of the problem. How can we fix the problem? We associate progress with fixing what's broken. Instead, the bright spot thinking really shifts the mindset to focus instead on amplifying what's quietly working within the organization. So I would say that as a consultant, a lot of the time, as I developed my consulting skills, I thought that my worth as a consultant was to come in and identify problems and fix them. But the reality is that organizations, large organizations that we've supported, especially at any size, but we've supported large organizations, have numerous examples of bright spots. And they often exist in the margins, practices that are quietly effective but not flashy. And I would say that what I've come across is that without psychological safety, people may hesitate to share what's working because they fear that they'll be misunderstood or that idea will be challenged or even shut down. When I work with organizations now, I think of, okay, how do we create a space to share success without scrutiny? Because that to me is the most essential piece. But there's a cultural challenge here. Success stories can't be perceived as bragging or self serving. They can be perceived, but the organization here has a real challenge, and that is to normalize what sharing in a way that looks like a collective good. So when we frame bright spot discovery as learning, this is really critical to me. When we frame it as learning, not as performance evaluation, it unlocks so much more hidden wisdom and insight that would otherwise remain invisible. And so that to me is kind of the crux of it. I love this idea of bright spot thinking.
And I love the distinction that you're drawing there, Dr. Barzel, with regards to the way that that investigation is packaged, right? Like if it
Right.
feels like scrutiny or like your performance is under evaluation, there's kind of a natural tendency for it to not reap as much value. And that really reminds me of things that you and I have talked a great deal about in the past about psychological safety and trust and the importance of that environment to really effectuating the right outcomes. And so it's just another place where I feel like this is cropping up from all the examples that we've talked about before. But I love this idea of bright spots and about sharing bright spots. You've talked about it in a general way, but I would love it if you would be able to walk us through your favorite specific example of bright spots, something simple, unexpected, or maybe surprisingly effective.
Okay, so this one is wonderful because, as you mentioned, it's surprising that I didn't expect it. So as much as I can remember from it, because it comes from my experience in an undergraduate art history lecture of all places, but the story involves a newly constructed apartment building. So it doesn't matter where our audience is, right? Every city has had these kind of ticky-tacky apartment buildings that are brand new. And when the structure was completed, the architect made an unusual design decision. Instead of immediately laying concrete sidewalks from the parking lot to the building, as you can imagine, and to the building entrances, they asked the landscape crew to simply plant grass across all the open spaces between the buildings and the parking areas. And then they waited. And over the course of the next few months, residents moved in and they began to naturally walk the paths that made the most sense to them. Some routes maybe curved, some cut corners, some connected to side doors. It doesn't matter. Each path essentially was shaped by actual needs, preferences, and what we often describe as lived experience of the people using that space. And eventually the grassy areas gave way to well-worn kind of dirt trails that you see on sometimes college campuses or anywhere, right? And it was clear visual evidence of the most effective and efficient, frequently traveled routes. So once those patterns became visible, the architect then came back, right? It often doesn't never happens this way, and paved the sidewalks directly on top of them. And it's a simple story. It's not mind blowing in any way, but I think that it stuck with me because it so beautifully illustrates what bright spot thinking is all about. Rather than assuming that they knew the best design ahead of time, the architect allowed for the solution to kind of quietly emerge organically from how people were using it. And eventually, this well-worn path is an example of something that worked, not because it was mandated, because it was useful. And when I think of it in organizational terms, we often default on top-down planning. So we pave before we observe, if you want to use it that way, right? But bright spots remind us just to wait, slow down, and let's look for what is already working. What behaviors, workarounds, maybe informal practices are signaling success. And I think that when we pause and we learn from those paths, we don't just get better outcomes, we get systems that respect the wisdom of the people closest to the work. And Bright Spots is about finding the nuance and the ingenuity and the brilliance of the people doing the work. So sometimes the smartest thing a leader can do, from that example, from that art history class, is just to plant the grass and watch where people walk. And that to me was just such a sweet example of an inconsequential but really important way of thinking about bright spots.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, Dr. Barzel, I reflect on that example as having been an organizational executive and leader myself. And I feel really convicted because I do recognize the tendency and the pressure, honestly, of leadership to determine a top down strategy, right? And to lead with this hypothesis based thinking for the sake of expediency or maybe just the organizational structures that we've created for ourselves with like a strat planning, cadence every year, and it's fairly rigid and it happens at the same time every year. So we as organizational leaders, I think, do not create the conditions for success enough for ourselves to actually be able to invest in these modalities that will produce superior outcomes. Because at the end of the day, if you design a process around the lived experiences and the wisdom of people engaging in that process, it is always going to be a lower friction system than a system that you've conceived cerebrally, but not necessarily observe the human behaviors attached.
Right, right. And to your point, Scott, I think about the leaders in a C-suite are trying to validate their worth. And so you have an organization that may have I don't know, it doesn't matter. You may have an organization that may have 2,000 employees, and you have a C-suite of maybe 10 or 12 people that occupy those senior spaces. It's odd. We tend to respect the opinion of those 12 people as knowing more, having more insight, having more experience, and they are dictating how the 2,000 people will operate instead of really trying to get the wisdom of people who are on the ground floor doing the work. And so you're right. I think just letting go from a leadership perspective and saying, hey, interesting, what can we learn from our people instead of what are people learning from us is really helpful.
Absolutely. And I think you mentioned a couple of important things there, Dr. Barzel, in terms of like, one, there is a level of distance depending on the size of your organization from the people making the decisions and their familiarity and proximity to the actual work being done. So
Right.
there's like a resolution gap in terms of like knowledge of
Yes.
the actual physical processes. But where else my mind goes, Dr. Barzel, is we are in an unprecedented time in history in that there are 5 generations of people actively working in our workforce today. And within those 5 generations, their lived experiences are vastly different. Because if you think about the older end of that continuum, we're talking about a pre-technology, pre-internet kind of circumstance where those people were raised and brought up, all the way to the Gen Zs who are entering the workforce in massive numbers and beginning to fill out those entry level and mid-level roles. And their experience with technology in the world that they engage with is completely different from everybody in the middle.
Right.
And so I think it's perhaps more important than ever to design in a human-centered way for lived experiences, because quite literally the world that we see before us is very different depending on the lenses that we adopted based off of when we were born.
Absolutely. Well said. I couldn't agree more.
Okay. Well, I want to dig into another specific example that you and I have chatted briefly about, and can't wait to share this with the audience. But you told me a story about a woman at a hockey game who
Right.
may have saved a man's life with just one bold action. And so I want you to tell us that story because it's fascinating. But also, I'd love to dig a little bit deeper and understand, what does this story teach us about agency, observation, and the hidden potential within everyday roles?
Okay, so I'm glad you brought this up because this is a story that I learned about from the New York Times. And I think one thing that drew me to the story was initially it was about hockey, and I'm a huge hockey fan. And so I was drawn to the story. But it's a beautiful story. But the story is of Nadia Popovinci. And yeah, I'll set the stage. She is a Seattle Kraken fan at a hockey game. And the game is in Seattle, and they're hosting the Vancouver Canucks. And I don't know if you've ever been to a hockey game or you know the layout of a kind of a hockey arena. You can get seats directly behind the player's bench and behind the penalty box. And if you're behind the player's bench, which I've been once, it's both like amazing and frustrating at the same time because you are inches away from the players who are seated. And so you see your favorite players. You can sometimes even catch words that they're saying. And I mean, the plexiglass is the only thing separating you. Like the access is remarkable. But at the same time, it can be frustrating because the people standing behind the players is the coach, the assistant coaches, maybe the medical staff, equipment staff. And this story is about this fan, Nadia Popovinci, sitting behind the glass, her parents seated next to her, and in front of her, obstructing her view of most of the game, is this assistant equipment manager by the name of Brian Hamilton. And so she's, trying to watch the game, but she's also staring at the back of Brian Hamilton's neck just because of where her seat is. Well, she noticed something unusual in the back of his neck. She was volunteering in hospitals, if I remember correctly, because she had a goal of one day attending medical school. But she didn't have any medical experience or clinical expertise. But through her experience, even volunteering in hospitals, she learned what to look for in moles that may be problematic. And Brian Hamilton had a mole on the back of his neck. She remembered that, okay, you have to look for asymmetry, maybe irregular borders, this unusual coloration, signs consistent with malignant melanoma. Now, look, she could have dismissed it. She could have assumed that he already knew. She could have second-guessed herself and stayed silent. I'm sure I would have, for sure, stayed silent. I don't think I would have been as brave as her, especially in this public setting where there was no formal authority, and she could have really come across fearing that she would be intrusive. But instead, and her parents were like, no, Nadia, don't engage. Come on. I'm sure he knows, it's not your place. But she was stubborn in a really good way. And she wrote a message that said, "The mole on the back of your neck is possibly cancerous. Please go see a doctor." And the words mole, cancerous, and doctor were in bright red. And at the end of the game, she banged on the plexi. And she finally got his attention. And when he talked about it, he thought, oh, this is just some obnoxious fan, like wanting to, I don't know, be obnoxious. But instead, she stuck her phone up to the thing and he's like, what? And he quickly looked at it and he thought, that's odd. And he walked out, he touched the back of his neck and he walked out and he asked the team physician, hey, is there a problem here? Do I have something on the back of my neck? And he said, yeah, I'm not sure because I'm not a skin doctor, but you should go get it checked out for sure because it doesn't look right. And the doctors later confirmed that her bold, kind of quiet move saved his life. He had indeed a type 2 malignant melanoma that was caught early enough that it could be removed. And Brian Hamilton, he did not thank doctors for saving his life. He thanked Nadia Popovinci. And there are these really profound lessons about agency in observations in complex systems. And I think that bright spots often appear in the gaps of a system. So let me give you some startling statistics. According to the CDC and lots of other peer-reviewed research, most melanomas, get this, are detected not by physicians. You would think they would be, but they're not. They're detected by patients, conservative observers, friends, partners, whomever, largely because many physicians don't conduct a total body scan or body exam unless they're prompted. Think about the last time you went to your primary care physician for a checkup. Right? Did they perform a full body scan? Probably not. But I'm not saying that they're not capable of it. That's not the case. They are. But we often, if I have a problem or something comes up in my annual, my doctor will say, have you any issues lately? Just similar, like a dentist will say, have you had any teeth that have hurt? And that's how this happened. So Nadia, with no medical license, acting in really a systems blind spot, was part of a system filled in this gap. That's the first thing. Number two, I would say that agency isn't about authority. We talked about authority just a second ago, about being in a leadership in a C-suite environment. It's about courage. Nadia had no formal role, but she had situational awareness and she had the moral courage to act. And so you might say, okay, well, maybe I would have the moral courage to act, but do you have the situational awareness? Or does someone have the situational awareness, but like me, would not have the courage to act? I wouldn't. So this is exactly what we talk about when we say we need to empower people at every level of the system so they can contribute meaningfully in an environment. Psychological safety, we've brought up, you and I, many, many times, and I can't harp on it enough. Nadia did worry afterwards, right? She does in the article, she says, was it appropriate of me to say something? And she had self-doubt. It wasn't as like easy as clear cut as I tell the story. She did. She spent the game, probably the majority of the game, wondering about the mole on the back of his neck and less about the game that she like paid for and is a fan of and wanted to like to be there. But that self-doubt, I would say, Scott, is something that we see in every organization. When someone tries to raise a concern or flag an issue with not knowing how it's going to be received. And building psychological safety means we are creating conditions where people don't second guess doing the right thing. They're encouraged to speak up, even when it's uncomfortable. And the fourth thing I would say is that bright spots are always replicable. I'm not dismissing anything that Nadia Popovici did. What she did was beautiful and brilliant, but it wasn't magic. The reality is she noticed something concerning, she acted respectfully, and she trusted the potential benefit outweighed the awkwardness or discomfort. And imagine, like when I tell you the CDC and is saying that we don't uncover melanomas at a high enough rate because we rely on physicians to do the investigative work, but that investigative work is not normal because it takes time and it's not right. The reality is, imagine what would happen if more people were equipped with this kind of knowledge and supported using it. What if we taught melanoma signs in high school health classes? For example, like think about how many people would notice a melanoma, their partner would notice it. And if we celebrated this kind of agency as a public health strategy, I think it would be beautiful. And the last thing I would say is that we have to normalize non-traditional leadership, and that's something we talked about many times. So Brian Hamilton, as I mentioned, was thanking a fan in the stands, and I think that just shows me how we define leadership. This is where it is. It's not always positional. Somehow approach organizations, especially ones that operate in hierarchy, that leadership is positional. But in this case, I would make the argument that it can be observational and it's often relational. So it's really encouraging us to say, you know what Nadia did was not necessarily only inspiring, but it was instructive. And the most powerful changes come from people that we least expect in moments where they're most afraid to speak up. But that's the culture that organizations need to foster. And I think that's a beautiful story of Nadia saving this man's life.
Man, what a rich example, Dr. Barzel. And, just a couple of things that I want to pick out from that example. I love this idea of non-traditional leadership. And, in the work that we do at Unity and Company, we have a signature leadership development program that we call Catalyst Leadership. We differentiate between leadership and management and individual contribution. And really, the difference between leadership above all of those things is leadership is about hearts, minds, and influence. It's about having or enabling a multiplicative impact for which the impact is greater than the sum of the parts. And you're right, you can do that without a formal leadership title, without having an organizational structure of dozens or hundreds of people reporting to you. You can have that influence just by having the intrinsic motivation to speak up, but it's just not the motivation itself. And so that brings up the second thing that I want to pull out for your example, which is courage. And in this example with the hockey game, you could argue that courage was easier to tap into because of the stakes involved. It was literally potentially a life or death situation. And so in those situations, I think people can really summon up, courage in them, even if there's fear layered on top of it, to do the right thing, given the fact that the stakes are so high. At work, the stakes are rarely as high, right? And so I think our job as leaders is to basically lower the threshold of courage required to actually speak up and have the impact that you want to have. And that, I think, is where psychological safety really comes in, Dr. Barzel, is creating the conditions where anybody of level knows that they can speak their mind without fearing a negative consequence for doing that, right?
And that they're encouraged to. No. Yes. That we want to hear from you.
Yes.
Think about how many times you've been in a work environment where you've been like, oh man, I would do this totally differently. But is anyone going to listen to you? Right? Like, who are you? Like, who am I? I would do it differently, but no one's asking me.
Hmm. Yeah,
And do they really want my opinion? Like, is there a place for
absolutely.
me to share it?
Well, that I think is a really great point, right? Because I think a lot of leaders are well intentioned and they navigate the world saying, "I'm open to suggestions if people came to me," but they're not
Right.
creating the containers for people to actually be able to do that. I
Right.
remember that I was working with an organization when I was working in corporate, and I was leading about a 400 person team, and we were effectuating some pretty massive process and cultural change at the time. And during this period of transition, one of the things that we did, in addition to just a really aggressive communication strategy so that everybody felt looped into how things were progressing and what decisions were being made, we also just had a container for office hours every week where I, as the
Good.
department leader, would just be available to hear anything in a non structured way from anybody in the organization, regardless of what level they were at. And I got to tell you, Dr. Barzel, the insights that I got just from having that forum and that protected space really equipped me to be able to make the right decisions that were ultimately adopted with zero friction. Because what was happening was, unbeknownst to me at the time, I was creating an army of emissaries that would really kind of go back out into their, their worlds, their teams, and basically say like, hey, we have influence. Like, we have the ability to speak up. We have the ability to even voice concerns and have them addressed or get primary information that we were not originally aware of, that causes us on the ground level to maybe rethink things, and be more supportive of things where maybe there would have been more resistance. And so I do think that this is a pro tip for leaders out there that are navigating change. And that's basically every organization today, because there's massive amounts of change at every part of the business ecosystem and hierarchy. But
But
go ahead.
wait, sorry, Scott.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you highlight such a beautiful example of your own work. But I think something that is missing from the conversation is you. Like, I know you as this beautifully empathetic person who demonstrates care and respect at every level. And I think that when you give the example of creating office hours, organizations might do that and follow that blueprint, but it can come across as very superficial unless the person on the other end of the line is sincere and authentic. You are sincere and authentic. And I believe that I would feel very comfortable. You would create an environment where I would feel very comfortable being open and honest. But sometimes in organizations, it can be very counterproductive and it can be, in fact, detrimental because it comes off as just talk. Yes, we have office hours. We want to come hear from you. And then you think, okay, well, I'll give it a shot. And then nothing happens or nobody really takes you seriously. And then it's quietly like in the background, people start to say, did anyone, I heard you say something, but I haven't seen anything change. Or I've heard you say something, but I haven't heard anything change. So at the end of it, people are wondering, well, was this just really like a superficial exercise? Your approach in leadership, like you have to have the right empathetic leader who is not playing a role, but it is really like this gem of a person who believes what they're doing, not just kind of following a protocols. I love that you shared that, but I think it's really important to stress that it takes two of those elements, and you provide both. I could see that quite clearly.
Well, thank you for the kindness of your comments, Dr. Barzel. And I do think that that is an important distinction, right? Like, I think there needs to be a level of authenticity and crucially follow through, right? Because I do think
Right.
that you can actually risk doing more damage by creating the space, listening and intaking all of the insights, and then not doing anything with it, or at least not visibly doing anything with it. So there
Right.
is more to that virtuous cycle that we were talking about. Before we move on to the next piece, I just wanted to bring up something you mentioned kind of at the top of your list of considerations is situational awareness. Right. And you mentioned it in terms of, a public health mandate, which seems, or a public health objective, which seems like large, right, in terms of scale and scope. But shrinking it down to the organizational size, I think that there are a lot of things that organizational leaders can do to create and equip situational awareness in people throughout the organization. I mean, everything from onboarding programs, some of the most effective onboarding programs that I've developed, participated in for cross-functional teams that work very closely together across functions, are the ones who basically say, here are the strategic objectives of your cross-functional partners. Like, here are the things that they're looking at. Here are the problems that they're looking at solving. And what it does is it activates a veritable army of people who are basically eyes and ears across the organization, looking at things from your lens, but from different vantage points. And what I've seen is just the effectiveness, the innovation, the collaboration that occurs in environments that basically start with this objective towards maximizing situational awareness and collaboration between teams actually helps to create the conditions where they do share bright spots more frequently, and they do let each other know of potential kind of watch-outs where they could be more aggressive in addressing the situation.
Yeah, we need leaders to feel less threatened by the fact that the people that they lead may know more than they do, right? Like, deference to expertise is an HRO principle. And it's this idea that, like, great, no one's saying that you're not capable of being in that leadership role. It's saying that you don't know everything that's happening. And let's go to the people who do this specific work and investigate. What is working well? What isn't working well? What would you do differently? And I think that's it. I suspect that in many of those instances, people feel threatened that, okay, well, I'm their leader. If I'm going to them and asking them what's not working well, it feels like I don't know. It's okay, but it's okay to be vulnerable. But I think we misunderstand how that gets communicated. These are big problems, right? These are cultural shifts that we need to change.
I love those insights. I hesitate to call it ego, right? But you mentioned it earlier at the top of this conversation. It is ego, but like people have like negative connotations around ego. But I really do think that there are a lot of leaders, even in the executive suite, or maybe especially in the executive suite, who are kind of unaware of where they derive their perceptions of self-worthiness, right? And unless you have that level of self-awareness, it becomes really hard for you to create these conditions whereby you can be humble, because it's always competing with your own internal sense of safety, right? If you're constantly thinking that you as the top leader has to have all of the answers and has to lead from a top-down way,
right,
and you haven't really done the work to contend with that within yourself, this stuff is going to sound completely counterintuitive, and it's going to be really hard to get yourself to do. So I do think that, like, that sense of safety that we talk about, that's so important for leaders to be effective. That safety starts with yourself, and really being able to admit to yourself, like, hey, this is where I'm deriving my value and worth. What if I suspended that belief for just a little bit and tried to lean into the idea that my people are smarter than me and my people can inform me, and in fact, we can co-create a solution together that is greater than the sum of the individual parts, or greater than either of us could do in a vacuum.
Right. And it goes to this point of, when I know we're deviating a little bit into leadership, but this idea of vulnerability, and I don't know if we talked about it the last time we connected. There was this, Dan Coyle wrote this great book about, I think it's called The Culture Code. Just a quick example in there, he talks about the SEAL Team 6, the commander of the SEAL Team 6 that eventually killed Osama bin Laden. And Dan Coyle interviews him and says, what is your leadership style? What is it about? And he says, I'm very comfortable with 4 words, and I say them often. I screwed this up. And he said, just by communicating that to the team, they see that as their leader, I'm telling them I screwed this up. It gives them agency to share where they've screwed up also. And not because we're doing a blame game here. We're not going around going, okay, these 3 people screwed up, so now this is their punishment. No, it's these 3 people screwed up, so let's find out what we can learn from these mistakes, because inevitably they're going to keep happening if we don't talk about them and uncover them. So
yeah. Such a powerful message of vulnerability in action, especially in that setting.
Right.
Like, you can imagine that, being surrounded by high performers that, engage in very dangerous activities like these are, but to also meet that group with that level of vulnerability.
Absolutely.
Can be really daunting, but it tells you a lot about the culture they've created in the SEALs. Like, Simon Sinek talks a lot about the SEALs too, and about trust, and how trust is a value organizationally within them, even above and beyond competence, right? Because when your life is on the line, trust becomes really important. Really, really important. Great examples, Dr. Barzel. Let's move into one more example, because I think this one is also a rich one. But you spend a lot of time working with the VA.
Yes.
And in your work with the VA, you discovered a surprising difference in patient fall rates between two hospital floors. And so I'd love for you to tell this story for our audience because I think it's just such a fascinating story. But I'd love for you to also go into like, what did that teach you about leadership, messaging, incentives, and systems design?
So it was really cool. I had the opportunity. I'll tell you that the Department of Veterans Affairs does really amazing work, and I'm really proud of their journey to high reliability. I would say that although they're under a lot of scrutiny, they're in the public eye, and they have congressional oversight. They are constantly looking to improve their improve upon their systems and patient safety. And I just have the utmost respect for the Department of Veterans Affairs. And in my work, I had a chance to travel to a lot of different hospitals to explore patient safety and how to reduce patient harm. And in one example I came across, which this is one you asked about and I wanted to talk to you, is about this one hospital in Kentucky, these two inpatient floors, the ninth floor and the 10th floor. And the ninth floor had a patient rate of nearing 10%, which is alarming. It's a very high patient fall rate. Even if you don't know anything about clinical settings, that is scary. Even on the 10th floor, also an inpatient floor, the fall rate was nearing just barely over 1%, which is fantastic. And you think to yourself, wait, it's the same hospital. How are these two floors, one separated by just I don't know, 20 feet? How are they operating so differently and so drastically? So the nurse managers on the ninth floor, where the fall rate was so high, had instructed their nurse technicians who often operate night shifts because they have they don't have the same clinical abilities that nurses have. As a nurse tech, they are trained, but not with the same responsibilities. So they were asked, hey, look, when you're doing the night shift, I'd like for you to go check in on all the patients, do rounds, open the door, make sure everything's okay. If it is, and the patient's asleep and everything's fine, close the door gently, move on to the next patient, and do that several times in the course of a night. And on the 10th floor, the nurse managers had instructed their nurse techs to go around and for every room they go into, instead open the door, make sure everything's all right. But in this case, we want you to go take a few steps towards the bed. We want you to gently wake up the patient. And we want you to say, hey, I'm just checking in on you. And while I'm here, would you like some assistance going to the bathroom? The reality is that a majority of falls in hospitals happen on the way to the bathroom. People are in unfamiliar places. They're on medication that makes them maybe dizzy or woozy or uncomfortable. And a lot of these falls are preventable, but they happen on the way to the bathroom. And even that's why, by the way, when you go to a hospital, you get, socks that have the sticky grips on them to help prevent falls. And sometimes even in hospitals, socks are color coded so that they know what fall risk you lie in. But the difference between the ninth floor and the 10th floor was really about leadership messaging. One team prioritized perceived satisfaction. And the problem is that the ninth floor was really dictated. The hospital had been pushing for need to do things to the whole hospital. We need to improve our patient satisfaction scores. And because you're dictated by the leadership directive to improve your patient safety scores, naturally you think, well, look, if I'm going to wake up a patient in the middle of the night in a place that they don't sleep well anyways, and I'm disturbing their sleep, they're going to be unhappy. And if they're unhappy, they're going to give me a low patient satisfaction score. And that's not going to be good for me, my department, my hospital, whatever. And so the 10th floor operated very differently, and they trusted that discomfort in the moment was worth it for the better outcomes. And the leadership on the lower fall floor really was empowering their staff to use their better judgment to support that even if their patient satisfaction scores went down, they had an opportunity here to help patients go to the bathroom, which happens oftentimes in the middle of the night. So I think what it really does is it reinforces this idea of that incentives, metrics, and messaging shape behavior. We know that. But so do values and culture. I mean, the reality is if we're not careful, we optimize for the wrong outcomes, right? And without listening deeply to the people doing the work, the nurse assistants in this case, we miss the subtle operational decisions that truly keep people safe. And I think that is, to me, is a beautiful example of a bright spot in action.
I think it's I think that's a really intelligent insight, Dr. Barzel, that obviously incentives can drive outcomes, right? Even unintended outcomes. And I love this contrast between your incentives and how those affect behavior and culture and values and how those affect behavior and how they both kind of work in concert to drive the behaviors and outcomes that you want. But it occurred to me as you were speaking that I actually feel like the incentives you end up choosing as an organization can be a reflection of your culture and values in that moment, right? I think like there is a level of intentionality that leaders can take with regards to setting KPIs and setting organizational standards and incentives that really come from a values driven place versus coming from a place to optimize a single variable, patient satisfaction. And I think that's the difference that I've seen working with organizations that do have a more holistic approach to employee engagement, that do have higher engagement, is that they don't just roll out initiatives with kind of a single dimension incentive. They're looking across a broad spectrum, a balanced scorecard, if you will,
Right.
and saying like, these are all of the attributes that we think are important, right? And in various concentrations, and, giving people just a little bit more context on, what are the boundaries in which we can and should operate to not only achieve our operational outcomes, but also our value-based outcomes as well.
Right. Right.
Cool. So we've gone through a couple of high octane examples here, Dr. Barzel. One in the hospital space, in the VA setting, and one in the city planning space with that example about the apartment complex that you talked about earlier.
Yeah.
And so I'd love to just get your insights contrasting and comparing the two. So what parallels do you see between systemic oversights in places like hospitals or city planning and the way that we unintentionally create harm or trauma inside of our organizations?
Okay, so you touched on it just a moment ago. You mentioned kind of this idea of a holistic approach. And I think it has to do with like holistic design also. If you think about in both hospitals or city planning, harm often doesn't originate from malice. It can, but that's not it. That's 99% of the time it doesn't. It comes from omission of something, fragmentation. Let's just think of this, for example, if you think of a hospital hallway, imagine a hospital hallway that is built that's too narrow for two stretchers to pass safely, or in a poorly marked crosswalk that puts pedestrians at risk. These are not failures of intent. They're just failures of design, where systems don't account for kind of these real human needs and behaviors. We think of this in human factors engineering, and the same is true in our organization, right? When we fail to design, because the work Unity does, and this podcast especially, you're looking at things in the environment that creates that. What are we doing when we fail to make people feel seen or heard or protected? And I think then we fail to design for emotional safety or equity or clarity. That's the outcome that we end up as maybe people might think of this as chronic mismanagement. But over time, these design gaps, and I think this is really crucial, is they accumulate into what we might call organizational trauma, right? Not these dramatic singular events, but these small repeated messages that say, hey, your voice doesn't matter here. And no one's saying it outwardly, but they're saying it subversively that it's communicated that way. And in practice, it can look like meetings where like we said, only senior voices are heard, or performance reviews that punish risk taking. And this whole idea of bright spots is to take risk. It can look like DEI efforts that are performative rather than systematic, excuse me. So each of these choices, though they may seem minor, I really strongly believe they have ripple effects. Dysfunctional systems produce predictable harm. And I think that's it. So I think the hard truth is this: the longer these conditions persist, the more they become normalized. And I know you've talked about this with other guests on your shows because I've listened to them. And I think then what happens is people stop reporting concerns. The system teaches people really to survive, not to contribute. And I think that to me is the scariest part of it. Right? I just want to get by. I just want to do my bid and get out for the day. I don't feel committed to giving more to this organization than I'm paid to do or that is expected of me. But there really is some very good news, because just like infrastructure, just like you can redesign a hospital or a crosswalk, you can redesign a system in an organization. It's not impossible. It's often can be done quite effectively in very few steps. And I would say it starts by creating space that is safe. You talked about creating a space in your example earlier about creating a space for people to process their experience and to share, to have the open office hours, to name what's not working. And then what I love in your example that I pulled from it, Scott, is that it gives people an opportunity to co-design. Okay, so you're saying to them, look, hey, come to me with what your concerns are, what you think we can do better, and then let's do it better. Maybe you give somebody the role of, hey, can I ask you to manage this piece of it? And people are like, wow, you not only are you taking what I'm saying seriously, but you're giving me the opportunity to run with it, to lead with it. And so I think when you think about trauma in the workplace, one thing is that it's not just something to prevent, it's something to design against. The opposite of trauma isn't just safety, it's dignity, it's autonomy, it's connection, it's meaning. And I think when we intentionally design for those things, we not only prevent harm, we kind of build organizations where, and I don't mean this to sound so blatantly obvious, but that's where people can truly thrive.
Absolutely. I think that if you create the conditions for people to be able to show up in an authentic and aligned way where they have agency and they know that they can have influence and impact, then what you're doing is you're really creating a multiplication of yourself. And I think that's what a lot of leaders really don't see or appreciate, like especially the ones that put so much pressure on themselves from a top-down ownership perspective, right? It feels a little bit scary at first, but kind of giving away some of that ownership, some of that perspective, some of that authority and sharing it with people actually brings back more in terms of insight, in terms of innovation, in terms of collaboration and engagement and follow through and consistency. I mean, the results are just multiplicative and exponential from there for sure. So we've talked a lot about the leadership side of things. I want to explore one more facet of that, which is why is it so hard for organizations and particularly organizational leaders to notice and scale what's already working within their walls? Because it's happening right under their noses already.
We are obviously having a conversation about that bright spots cannot surface and support an organization's transformation if it is not for leadership, right? Because bright spots are simply defined as solutions hiding in plain sight. And as we talked about earlier, they rarely come from the top of the organization, or they rarely come from a formal strategy document or whatever. More often, they just form from ingenuity, a nurse tweaking a handoff routine, a case manager rephrasing a script to better engage clients, whatever it is. These are just creative, context-specific, and adaptive behaviors, often born, again, not from politics or policy, but from proximity to the problem. That's why you have to understand the people who are the front line, right? And I think here's the challenge. Bright spots don't come wrapped in metrics or business cases that we're used to. They're often undocumented. They're often informal. They're deeply embedded in relationships and local culture. They are within, if you're examining a bright spot, it's not necessarily helpful to examine a bright spot in another organization. Sure, you can learn what's working well in other places, but they come from within because you have your own culture. Like something that in another hospital may not work in your hospital. It sounds good, but it may not work because you don't have the same systems in place. So I think they're easy to overlook. When psychological safety is low, as we've harped on before, right? People behind these innovations maybe just be hesitant to speak up. They downplay their success. They fear pushback. They may think, this isn't scalable. Like, who am I, right? Again, back to that, like, I'm not worthy, or I don't add value, or, right? Or I don't want to get in trouble for doing something outside the standard process. We have an SOP, and who am I to start messing with it? And someone's going to think I'm lazy, or I'm somehow being obstinate. And it's not true. When the culture doesn't reward experimentation, or worse, and if it penalizes deviation, people are going to keep their bright spots quiet. And that's a profound loss, not only for innovation, but the reality is it's for collective learning. So you asked about leaders, and I would say that leaders play a crucial role in reversing this dynamic. I mean, it's not irreversible. This is stuff that we can add back into the design. The first step is just to stop looking for solutions to scale and instead cultivate a mindset, I would argue, of inquiry, right? where is something quietly going well and what can we learn from it? And that reframing changes the tone from extraction to exploration. We want people to be curious. It shifts the spotlight. And I think that at the end of the day, instead, I think we have to resist the urge to turn bright spots into this one size fits all mandate. So I would say, like, we could ask maybe what principles or conditions made this possible? Maybe how might others experiment with this locally? When you build a culture, this is what we're going back to, right? This integrated bright spots is so integrated with culture and leadership and psychological safety. And when you build a culture where people are rewarded for learning aloud, where stories where they take those chances, where bright spots are no longer anomalies, they become seeds of strategy. That leads to trust, curiosity, humility from learning from those closest to the work. And I think that is integral to the success of any organization. But it's so clear when we say it out loud. And then it's mind-boggling when organizations don't do it.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, and you know what, Dr. Barzel, it really occurs to me. I mean, because even reflecting back on my own experience as a leader, right? Like I've definitely had some humbling moments. And one of the things that you just articulated is the importance of curiosity as a precondition for success here, right? And I think about the antithesis of curiosity being assumptiveness, and furthermore, assumptiveness that you are right. That conviction that comes with rightness blocks curiosity, right? And if that is the way that leaders are kind of like navigating through their roles, right, then obviously, like, even if bright spots are happening right underneath your nose, you don't have the necessary curiosity to investigate it and open the door, because you functionally put blinders on yourself with, that are defined by the parameters of your own rightness. And so I do think that this is a challenge for leaders. It's, and I think we all go through cyclical times in leadership where sometimes when you're leading through a huge change, you feel like you have to be that unwavering beacon of certainty in the storm. But sometimes that can have a counterintuitive approach on engagement and trust, right? Sometimes it actually helps to, to be able to say vulnerably, like, hey, we have a thesis that this is the right way to go. And we have conviction based off of the things that we have studied and we have known and we have researched. And that being said, we are still creating the opportunity to explore where we might have blind spots, where we might have limited access to primary information that you all have, right? Like, so again, another concept you brought up earlier is co-design. Let's co-design this together. And I do think that that requires a level of curiosity, a level of humility, a level of suspending certitude,
Yes.
in favor of something a little bit more broad spectrum.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that.
So along this theme of curiosity, how do you help teams to start asking the miracle question? And what tends to happen when they do?
Okay, so let's just to frame it, the miracle question comes really from the work of Dan and Chip Heath and in their bright spot thinking. Right. So that's how I came across this whole bright spot concept. And the miracle question that they pose in the book and in their literature is, if your challenge disappeared overnight, what's the first small sign that things have changed? And I love it's simple and disarming at the same time. It bypasses this instinct to rehash problems or defend past decisions. Nobody's asking you about any of that. It's not looking for the 5-year vision. It's asking for tomorrow morning. So when I pose the question to a team, or when I've done it, there's often like this moment of stillness, like, oh, and then maybe someone might say, I don't know, we'd laugh more, people would speak up more in meetings. I think there's a general change. They're not superficial. They're windows into this emotional truth or clarity of an organization. They reveal what people are really craving and what's been lost along the way. And I would say that what makes this so impactful is that it resurfaces relational shifts, not just operational ones. So we're not talking about the miracle question doesn't yield answers. I've never heard anyone say like we'd implement a new dashboard or we'd meet quarterly metrics. No, it talks about how people would feel and how they would interact and what they'd no longer be afraid to do. That's the essence of psychological safety. When people begin to describe a future where they feel seen, trusted, and safe to contribute. We know that we're on the edge of transformation. It's so beautiful. And once a team names those early signs of success, the next question that the Heath brothers lay out is, okay, where do we already see glimpses of that? That's how we start to discover the bright spots, right? That's where it is. Maybe one team member, maybe it was one team meeting in the last month that felt different. You're like, oh, okay. Well, maybe it was one manager that already created that sense of openness, right? It's like maybe you're the only one that's having the office hours and nobody else is doing it. You think it's the right approach for you, but nobody else is taking that on. Maybe someone took a risk last week and it went better than expected. So the reality is that these glimpses aren't anomalies. They're prototypes, and they offer this pattern to get us to say, man, there's something good going on here. Let's expand it. I think one thing that I have seen done poorly with the miracle question that I would hesitate to, like, I would encourage people to be very careful, cautious with, is not asking why things aren't better. Like, why are things better already here? Instead, we ask, what would it look like if they were better? Because that shift moves from this defensive-ness where people are really like, ouch, that I feel like I have to stand my ground. That's really personal, to instead one of creativity. What are the conditions we can create for experimentation rather than perfection? And we're talking about low risk actions here that we can take immediately. We're not talking about changing the strategic plan of an organization. So the miracle question, I would say, acts, and according to the Heath brothers, I mean, this is really beautiful, but they act as both kind of something that's diagnostic and a catalyst at the same time.
Mm, yeah.
Right? What would most people do, and while restoring their sense of agency? And it says, you know what? You don't have to have all the answers. I'm not asking you to solve the problem. I'm asking you to identify what it feels like, what it looks like, and then let's search for places where that's happened. Right? I'm not asking like that. It's so low risk. And change, I think, from there becomes we build with people in mind, not necessarily for people. And so I think it's really helpful. I mean, good on Chip and Dan Heath. I mean, they have wonderful insights into organizational culture and behavior.
I am also a very big fan. And it's so funny because this book that a lot of these concepts are derived from, or that the bright spot concept is derived from, has literally been, as an organizational leader, when I was working for corporations, it was my guide to change management.
Yes.
I brought it off my bookshelf time and time again whenever I found myself tasked with leading a large organizational change. And every time you read it, there's something new. So highly recommend that for our listeners. If it's not a book that you've read yet, I think it's called Switch.
Yeah. How change
changes chart.
But I will say,
I'll put it in the show notes.
It's important because I actually assign it as a required reading for my students at Vanderbilt because it's brilliant, and they love it. They love it. They love that it doesn't read like a textbook. It's a book about people's experiences and insight into how we behave and respond. It's great.
And with a really powerful and fun metaphor as kind of like the central guiding principle. So contrasted with like John Cotter's Leading Change, which is also a really definitive guide on change management.
Right.
That's kind of more like the dry kind of like business school approach, versus I think Chip and Dan Heath do a really great job of kind of bringing it down to earth, but still retaining the impact behind the points, and giving you a playbook that organizational leaders can use when they're leading change. So bringing it back to our core listeners, which do happen to be organizational leaders. So
Right.
If we have leaders who are listening to this and who are wondering, okay, this all sounds great, but where do I begin? What's the first small step that I can take to uncover a bright spot in our organization and start reaping all of the benefits that we've talked about so far?
Okay, I think that's a great tool for a leader to have. I would say that the best first question is deceptively simple. I would say just ask, who's doing something that's quietly working and why haven't we paid more attention to it? I think that reframing does two things, Scott. I think first, it signals that you're interested in learning from what's going on and not just fixing what's broken. And second, I think it acknowledges that innovation often lives in the margins, in the small, kind of quiet adaptations that people make every day to get the work done better, faster, and with more heart and purpose. The key, so you talked about following up, right? And I think that is essential for people to feel heard. But I think what's important here is to distinguish between following up with care and following up with directives. So instead, we follow up with appreciation, inquiry, care, not directives, not policy. Don't immediately turn that success into a policy or a checklist. Ask instead, how did you come up with that? Why do you think that worked here? Because it may not work in another department, in the same facility, in the same place. So why do you think that worked here? We're not evaluating people. We're just asking them to kind of surface the practices, the mindset, the conditions that made things possible. And I would say that bright spot thinking, although we're tempted to kind of begin it with replication, it starts with recognition. Again, maybe for the 7th time we've talked about psychological safety in our time together today, but it's the clearest ingredient, the clearest, most important ingredient here. That not every success story needs to be a blueprint for the whole organization. That's not what bright spots is necessarily it. It can be, but that could be also the fastest way I would say to kill a bright spot is to try and scale it. Try to scale it too fast with understanding the context, how it works. The goal is deep listening, what's working and why, and then build a community of shared learning around that. One of my favorite ways to uncover bright spots is to simply ask teams, what's something that you've done this month that you're proud of, but weren't sure anyone noticed, right? Think about that.
That's a great question.
And that's often where the richest insights, live. These are the moments they're born from care and creativity, not from this top-down direction. They don't need funding first. They just need curiosity, care. They need a leader willing to say, tell me more. That's it.
That's such powerful insight, Dr. Barzel, because I do think that organizations these days are operating at a really frenzied pace. And I think the way that manifests within organizations is leaders feel stressed and pressured to move to scale, to move to a tangible solution, to not create the space for investigation and curiosity. And I do think that by starting there, it's like this idea of you need to go slow to go fast, right? You do invest a little bit more time at the front end, but the benefits that you get on the back end are almost innumerable, right? Because what you're doing is creating an empowerment model or an empowerment dynamic that actually sends trickle downs of benefits throughout your organization, instead of trying to scale and codify a single dimension of benefit that you don't really even fully understand if it'll work. This has been just such an insightful conversation, Dr. Barzel. I'm always just so inspired by your level of curiosity and introspectiveness, and then your insight to the application of how these concepts can actually be scaled and implemented and repeated with leaders and organizations across industries and contexts. So that being said, in your travels, what's something that you've encountered recently that's changed your mind in your own work?
So for a long time, I have to say, I keep maturing and adjusting my thinking about this stuff because it's a learning process. And for a long time, I really operated with this thinking that trust had to come first. That before you could invite people into change, you had to establish credibility, you had to lay the groundwork, you had to build the relationship. And certainly all of that is essential. I'm not diminishing it. But I've come to realize when you waiting for it can become a form of a delay that dissuade action from happening. So I've learned that you build trust by inviting people in, especially when the plan is still emerging. So when you say, I don't have all the answers, but I value your perspective, you model the kind of openness and humility that accelerates trust rather than postpones it. And it's vulnerable, right? It doesn't feel good always to say, I'm not sure what the right answer is here. I'm not sure what the right approach is. I'm not sure where we should go from here. I'm not sure where we should invest our time and energy. But to say to somebody, but I would really value hearing from you, oh my God, makes them feel heard. And I think that transparency and vulnerability aren't just leadership traits. I would argue that they're strategic assets. So they tell your team, this is not a performance. This is a process where we're figuring this out together. And in doing so, we create psychological safety. So maybe the 8th time we brought it up. You shift from a culture from where you say, we'll wait until, we're not waiting until it's perfect. Instead, we say, let's co-create something better, right? And I think that's one of the biggest lessons I've learned is in the process, how we engage the people is the change we want. We want them to collaborate more. We want to see them invested more. We want them to take more risk. We want them to share and speak out loud. And if we really want belonging, we really need to build into this idea that it's genuine, it's authentic, and that it comes from a place of sincerity.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Barzel, you again, just thank you so much for coming back on the show and sharing these insights on change management and change leadership with us. It's definitely a topic that is perennially of value to organizational leaders, but perhaps especially today in this day and age as we have multiple disruptions, within the workplace that a lot of organizations are really thinking about how to implement. So it wouldn't surprise me that if upon hearing this podcast, you might have piqued the interest of some of our listeners and they may want to investigate getting in touch with you to work on things that are going on in their organization. So if somebody is interested in learning more about the work you do or potentially collaborating with you on an engagement in the future, what's the best way for our listeners to get in touch with you, Dr. Barzel?
So I would love that. I mean, I mean this with all sincerity. I would love for people to reach out and say, hey, do you want to collaborate on something? Do you want to can we get your insight on something? This is where we're dealing with. And I would love to share. The best way, LinkedIn is easy to find me, Ur Barzel. So it's URBARZEL. And I'm only one of them. So easy to find me on LinkedIn, right? Similarly, I don't have to compete for numbers after my Gmail. It's like URBARZEL at Gmail. There's no numbers. I got lucky there. And that's probably the best way for people to reach out. And I love that we have these conversations. I love that we have this opportunity to kind of for you and I to reflect on this stuff. And I really hope that it provides a new approach for people to kind of consider what they've done and how they might want to tweak what they've done to make it better.
Absolutely. Well, and I just know that anybody who is fortunate enough to speak with you and collaborate with you will just bring untold value to their organization, Dr. Barzel. So
Thank you.
I appreciate
Thank
you
you so
sharing
much.
so generously from your wisdom and experience with us. For our listeners that joined us today, I want to thank you all for joining us on this episode of the Workplace Therapy Podcast. If today's conversation with Dr. Barzel sparked something for you or got you thinking differently about leadership and culture, we'd love it if you subscribed and left us a review. The Workplace Therapy Podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever it is that you get your podcasts. It really helps more people to find the show and join the conversation. If you're curious about the work we do at Unity & Company, from executive coaching to team development and full-scale cultural transformation, just shoot us a note at info@unityandcompany.com. We'd love to connect with you. And until next time, keep showing up with curiosity, courage, and care, because that's where real leadership begins. Thanks. See you guys next time.